On the last episode of Menace, the Ken story. Rob had kidnapped the kids, pending Ken's ability to come up with another $25,000. Left with few options, Ken decided that breaking the law was his last resort, or rather his first. Over the course of that week, Ken robbed several businesses, bringing his total to $18,399. He needed another $6,601. He was searching his brain for an idea when Pops called. Pops came over and informed Ken that he knew Mia was dead, forcing Ken to tell him the whole story. As a result, Pops presented Ken with an idea about how they could get the money. And against everything in him, Ken realized he'd have to trust Pops. And now, Chapter 26, The Setup, narrated by Shandora Warren. Preface. Things couldn't have happened exactly the way they did unless it was set up exactly the way it was. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like life gets set up a certain way so things can happen. For instance, I drove to Mom and Pop's house that Friday morning so we could head out. Pops was supposed to drive his car to the gambling spot, but as it turned out, he claimed he didn't have enough gas and we didn't have the time to stop. I knew Pops like the back of my hand. He had gas. Pops didn't like to put a lot of miles on his car, so he claimed to have needed gas. As a result, I drove my car. That would set some things in motion that day, things that couldn't have occurred otherwise. We headed out early that Friday morning and went out to Pop's gambling spot. It was about 2 hours away. I had done so much mess in my life, but for some reason, I was more nervous that day than I had been in a while. I think it was the understanding that I was depending on someone else, Pops at that. I was depending on Pops to count cards, and I knew this nigga couldn't even really spell. And on top of that, he had failed to mention one minor detail the day before. He was flat broke. That being said, I had to put some money up for him to gamble. That made the stakes even higher. If he lost, not only were we not adding back to what I owed, but we were also putting a dent into what I already had. I couldn't afford to work backwards, so that added even more stress to the situation. It was Friday, and I had to have $25,000 by 5 o'clock Sunday afternoon. We got to the place around 8 o'clock in the morning. It turned out that Pops was every bit as good as he said he was. He was like a card-counting savant. If I didn't know, I wouldn't have had any idea that's what he was doing. But that was the good liar in him. He lost just enough to make it look credible. And when it was all said and done, we walked out of there with $5,239. I don't know what happened. Pops had actually gotten up to over $6,000. But then he started to lose for real. Once he realized that he wasn't going to get back up, he decided to cut his losses. It wasn't worth it to potentially go down any less than that. And I couldn't be mad. Pops came through. He did exactly what he said he was going to do, and a little bit more. I had awakened that morning with $18,399. With the $5,239 that Pops won, I was up to $23,638. I had managed to come up with that amount in 1 week. I think that's impressive by anybody's standards. But impressive or not, it wasn't $25,000. And I knew Rob. Short was short, whether it was $1,000 or $1. And I was $1,362 short. Don't worry about it, said Pops. We're way too close. We can scrape that up. But I was worried about it. It was like being in the desert and seeing a mirage. Like it was there, but not really. And I felt like the closer I got, it just kept moving further away. I was shaking and nervous. I had even started biting my fingernails. You gotta chill, said Pops. I'll tell you what. I know a couple of people that I might be able to borrow from. Worst case scenario, we're gonna have to sell some stuff tomorrow. We're gonna make this happen, but you need to relax a little bit. Let's sit down and have a drink. Well, you have a drink to calm your nerves, and I'm going to drive us home. We'll get up bright and early tomorrow morning and start over. We went to this little raggedy bar on the strip. I had a few drinks, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. Drinking hadn't ever really had that effect on me. So I decided to smoke a joint while Pops was driving us home. And even though smoking typically mellowed me out a little bit, nothing was working that day. I don't think anything really had the ability to work. The fact was, it was nearly 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I had precisely 48 hours to come up with $1,362. And regardless of how many people would have told me that it could be done, I wasn't going to feel at ease until I had all of it in my hands. And I didn't have it in my hands. That goes back to the setup. Things couldn't have happened in the way that they did that day unless everything had been set up exactly the way it was. Pops was supposed to drive that day, but he didn't. He said he didn't have gas, so I drove. I drive my car, but I was a wreck because we were still short on the money. As a result, Pops decided to drive my car because he felt like I needed a drink. Pops never drove my car, and I decided to take that drink. Why? I didn't even drink like that. I wasn't a drinker. I hadn't ever been. Nonetheless, all of those conditions contributed to the perfect setup, or the imperfect setup. We were approximately an hour away from home, and I was still feeling antsy and drunk. Pops was driving, and I was staring out of the window. He was talking about something, but I had tuned him out. I wasn't paying attention to him. I couldn't. My mind was still focused on the situation. All I could think was, what if we don't get that money? And then it happened. It was purely opportunistic, but everything was set up for that thing to happen on that day. We were driving through a city. I could tell that it was one of those places where wealthy people lived. That was obvious by the buildings and the types of restaurants that lined the streets. We didn't have those types of restaurants in our area. We approached a stoplight. Pop said something about needing to stop for something. I don't really remember. All I know is the idea hit me, and I couldn't let it go. I couldn't tell Pops. He wouldn't ever have agreed. But all of the conditions had lined up, and I knew I had to take a chance. If Pops had driven his car, it couldn't have happened that way. But he didn't drive. And because he didn't drive, all of my things were in my car. I grabbed a bag that was under the passenger side seat and jumped out of the car. I slammed the door and ran, making sure Pops didn't have the chance to stop me. I ran back towards the area that we'd just passed, finding refuge between two buildings. I immediately turned my phone off and put it into my pocket. I peeked out, making sure that Pops hadn't managed to find me. Once I realized that the coast was clear, I took 3 things out of the bag: a gun, a pair of gloves, and a ski mask. It was my robbery bag. I had been using it to rob places all week. If Pops had driven his car, that bag wouldn't have been accessible in that moment. But Pops didn't drive. If Pops hadn't needed to stop for something, we probably wouldn't have been in that area. But we were in that area, and everything was set up for me to do what I had to do, and I was going to do it. I placed the gun in my waistband. Then I put the ski mask on and rolled it upwards, making sure that it would be properly positioned when I needed it. I didn't pull it down over my face at that point because I didn't want to call attention to myself too early. Lastly, I put on the gloves, and then I ran into the bank, pulling down my mask at the last minute. I entered, breathing heavily and shaking like a leaf on a tree. I guess I was fortunate that it was nearly closing time. Otherwise, the bank would have been overflowing with people. The second I walked in, I saw a security guard to my right. Present day, I have always wondered if he had a gun. I don't really know. But in my mind at the time, he had a gun. And if he had a gun, he was going to shoot me. I didn't give him time to think because if he had time to think, he had time to react. I couldn't afford for him to react because his reaction would likely make the difference in whether I was going to get that money or not. So I fired the gun. It was one single shot, and it landed directly into the center of his forehead. He flew backwards and slid down the wall. I could immediately tell that he was dead. I wasn't thinking about the right or wrong of what I had done. My mind was only thinking about disposing of the threat, and I did that. But in doing so, I created pure chaos. Suddenly, the room filled with the sounds of gasps and screams. I had to gain control of the situation, so I demanded that everybody get onto the floor. And they did. I knew my time was limited, so I went right in for it. I ran to the counter and jumped over. One of the tellers was yelling and being dramatic. She was the type to hit the button. I could tell. So I made her get onto the floor to make sure that she couldn't touch anything. And that left one teller standing. She wasn't yelling, so I felt that she was calm enough to just give me the money without making any trouble. But to make sure she knew I meant business, I pulled the gun up. And then I saw her face. Years later, she had that exact same face. It was Shalonda. My immediate thought was, does she know it's me? I wasn't sure, but I stuck to what I came there to do. I told her to put the money in the bag where I'd blow her head off. I spoke softly, trying not to scare her. But the crazy thing is, she wasn't scared. And that's when I knew she knew it was me. I had seen fear in Shalonda so many times. I knew how she looked when she was scared. She would have been terrified if some random stranger had a gun in her face. She wasn't scared because she knew I wouldn't shoot her. But there was something in her face. I couldn't place her expression. That concerned me because I knew it could go either way. Shalonda and I shared a crazy history. At one point, we had been madly in love in the most ridiculous way. I went to jail trying to protect her. I took her in and took care of her. I loved her. I chose to. I wanted to. And to that point, I hadn't ever felt that way about anybody else. But at the same time, we hadn't seen each other in years. And the last time we saw each other, Shalonda had called the police because she wanted to be escorted from my house. I'd hurt her so badly and made her feel so unsafe that she needed to go that far. That had been like 15 years or so in the past. It was entirely possible that Shalonda had spent all of that time thinking about the ways that I'd hurt her. And because I had a daughter, I understood. If I had gone off of the advice that I would have given Kennedy, I would have told her to hit that button. But it was me, and I'd always been a fighter. And that time, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Kennedy and Malik, too. So I dug deep. With tears in my eyes, I looked at Shalonda and whispered, I look in your eyes, and I know that you still care for me. It was a line from her favorite song, Where Do Broken Hearts Go by Whitney Houston. I hope that it will be enough to make her reconnect with the part of herself that still cared enough to not want to see me go back to prison. Shalonda looked directly into my eyes, but she disconnected from our gaze and quickly glanced down. I looked down as well and spotted a set of keys with a Jaguar emblem on them. Shalonda was giving me her keys. I discreetly grabbed them. In that moment, I knew she wasn't going to hit that panic button. And Ken showed back up. To make sure Shalonda looked like a victim, I really pressed the issue. With a little bit more authority, I said, put the money in the bag or I'll blow your head off. Shalonda opened the drawer and filled the bag with money. And when I say she fills it up, I mean she fills it up. I grabbed the bag and ran out of the door. I got outside and found the one Jaguar in the parking lot. I couldn't believe my luck. And suddenly, I realized I had impulsively jumped without so much as a getaway plan. What would I have done if Shalonda hadn't given me those keys? Again, everything was just set up a certain way. I slowly drove away, making sure that I didn't call attention to myself. And I just kept driving. I didn't have any idea where to go, so I settled on the one place that I didn't think anybody would find me, Shalonda's place in the woods. It was just over an hour away. To my surprise, the key was still in the same place. Everything was still in the same place, including the dirt. I dumped all the money onto the old wooden floor and started to count it. When it was all said and done, Shalonda had loaded over $150,000 into that bag, clean and unmarked. I had far more than what I needed to get the kids back. But once I came down off of that rush, the reality of what I had done hit me hard. I had killed somebody. Not only did I feel guilty about the murder, but it was bigger than that. It didn't take place in some random corner somewhere. I killed a man in a bank that had security cameras, a bank where my ex-girlfriend worked, and she knew it was me. I had a mask and gloves on, but what if they put the images on TV and somebody recognized me? Shalonda had let me get away, but what if she had a change of heart? She was no criminal. All it would take was for the police to apply a little bit of pressure. Shalonda would crumble like a cookie. I knew that the odds were more than likely outside of my favor. I just have to face that when the time came, but I needed to get to Rob. It would have been insane for me to have gone through all that, only to get caught and miss the deadline. But I had an issue. I had driven Shalonda's car there. There was no way that I was driving it to Rob's. The police would have been on me before I would have made it back to the roadway. So I did the only thing that I knew to do. I turned my phone back on and called Pops. He started yelling the second he answered the phone. "What you doing, Ken? You on drugs or something? I hope you don't think I'm going back to get you, cuz I'm already at home now." I cut him off and told him that I did need for him to pick me up, but I was very close to home. I told Pops that I explained everything once he was there. Pops called 30 minutes later, telling me to walk around. He was parked all the way on the other side of the lake because this nigga didn't want to drive down the path and get his car dirty. But I needed for him to come to the shack. It was important. And that set some things into motion. Pop walked to the shack that day because I told him that there was something very important that I needed for him to see. He refused to drive his car down there because he didn't want to get it dirty. Once Pops was inside, I showed him the money. He asked one question. "What you do, Ken?" So I told him. I told him the whole thing. "I messed up, Pops. I ain't playing it. I just had the car in the bag from the robberies that I had been pulling all week. I saw that bank and I decided that I had to try it. When I went in, I saw a security guard. In my mind, it was me or him. So I decided it had to be him. I killed him. And it just so happened that one of the tellers was an ex-girlfriend of mine. I think she recognized me, but she gave me the money and let me get away. That's her car outside. Look, I don't know how it's going to play out, but I feel like I'm probably going to go down for this. All I'm concentrating on is getting that money to Rob before any of that happens. I wanted you to come in here so I could show you something. I'm going to take $25,000 out to give to Rob, and I want you to take me straight there now. I'm going to put the rest of the money under this floorboard. I don't want to take the chance of getting caught with it on me. If anything happens and I go down, I want you to come back and get it. And I want you to get rid of that car. But this is the thing. I need you to use the money to take care of Kennedy and Malik. Mia's gone. They ain't got no mother. If I get picked up, they won't have me either. I need you to promise that you and Ma will take care of them if the state lets y'all have them. And I mean really take care of them. Both of them. None of that crazy favoritism nonsense you did with me and Kenny. This is the only thing that I'm ever going to ask of you." Pop started to say something. But before he got a chance, he paused. "Shh. You hear that?" We both stopped to listen. Very faintly in the distance, we could hear the sound of sirens. In my heart, I knew they were there for me. "How'd they find me?" I exclaimed. Pops was silent for a second, and then he said, "Give me the gun." "Heck no. We ain't about to do no shootout." Pops looked me squarely in the eyes. I have never seen that level of sincerity in him. He said, "Ken, you're right. I ain't do right by you, and I definitely didn't do right by Kenny or Adrian. I probably ain't gonna do right by Kennedy or Malik either. Mia's gone, and them kids gonna need you. Ain't nobody gonna love them like you, not even your mama. So we need to make sure that you're the one that's gonna be here to raise them. All they know is that somebody robbed the bank and killed the guard, right? The robber was wearing gloves and a mask, so they don't have a face or prints, right? You and I are nearly the same height, weight, and skin complexion. So who's to say it wasn't me? I need you to take all of that money and run. My car is parked on the other side of that lake. If you make it there before the cops make it here, I'll say it was me. The stolen car is here and the gun that killed the guard is here. I'll just say that I'm refusing to tell them where the money is. Now give me the gun and run. You gotta get to Rob before they catch you. Your car is parked at the house and your keys are on the driver's seat. I didn't have the time to process what Pops was doing for me. He was right. I had to get to Rob before the cops got to me. I took the gun out of my waistband and passed it over to Pops. He gave me his car keys. Immediately, he started wiping the fingerprints off. We hugged and I ran out the door. I ran like a madman. I ran like my life depended on it because it did. My life, Kennedy's life, and Malik's life all depended on it. And I suppose some things had already been set up in that regard as well. Shalonda and I had been in every single inch of those woods. I knew them like the back of my hand. So when it was time to run, I was able to navigate through every back corner. Eventually, I saw Pop's car. He was all the way on the other side of the lake. But the fortunate part was, the car was located in an area that was far removed from the shack. The cops weren't anywhere nearby. I stuck the key into the ignition, wheezing and out of breath. Suddenly, I heard gunshots. I drove away calmly, assuring that I wouldn't call attention to myself. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shinny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Please like, follow, and share this podcast with your friends, family, and frenemies, because all relationships matter, even the toxic ones. Thank you so much for helping me create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.